We would also like to give a chance, because Gerfried has to leave in the afternoon, to ask some questions here. So Steve, what struck me also in your really very interesting lecture is this term you used, the shock of the new. Do you feel that we are still in the stage that people are just about to discover media art, or can we assume that now that everyone has mobile phones and is immersed with digital technologies, that this shock of the new is already gone and we can already start with this kind of general knowledge that media art can be art?
I think we can, one of the big changes has been the ubiquity of technology. But alongside that, I think you've had two key developments. One is that the technology has become so advanced, if you like, that one of the initial problems, I think, was that technology came into the foreground. So people noticed the technology, if you like, before they noticed the art. And I think now, both because the technology is so much more advanced than it was, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago, as well as that our familiarity with that technology has developed so much, that it's in the background and people aren't curious about the technology in quite the way they might have been 20, 30 years ago. And I think there's this, related to that, there were a group of people who were interested in using these technologies, and actually the people who were producing art at the time were really technologists more than artists. And they were interested in the capability of the technology as technology rather than as a medium for expression, investigation, etc. And so I think that you've had people with perhaps a deeper artistic sensibility becoming more involved in the market, in using it than there were 20, 30 years ago. So I think there's a couple of things there that I think mean that it's a really interesting time now for what we might term media art because of that. Because I think it's really it's exciting because you know, you do have curators, for example, suddenly effusing over Ian Cheng. The danger is obviously that they forget what's gone before, and I think it's important to contextualize things, and I think that's down to people like the gallerists and the curators to do exhibitions that achieve that, so that the really great pioneers, as it were, don't get left behind. But I think the shock of the new is still there in the sense that, as Christiane's pointed out, just the challenge of getting of how it's dealt with in a museum collection, just because of the database, and that's, you know, what Christiane said is true in virtually every museum in the world. So there's technical issues like that. So it's still new relative to painting. And I still think that we need to be fostering a really powerful critical debate about it and the creation of a critical theory that goes alongside it. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Yeah, I mostly wanted to second that. I agree with every point Steve made, and what I think is still missing is a deeper understanding of the art. So there may not be the shock of the new anymore and the technologies are ubiquitous, but that doesn't go hand in hand with an understanding of the medium, which we still very much need. And I also see a major change now in artists. So all of the older, quote unquote, older artists, they were writing their own software. Ask someone like Ken Feingold about the AI driving his pieces, and he will go down to minute details of weighting of how he created the characters. Many of the younger artists, and I don't mean this as, don't get me wrong, this is not a criticism, they will say, I have no idea, I'm using services. they are not writing this anymore, but they're using off-the-shelf software. And it's great that off-the-shelf software allows more people to get into this field and also do really great and meaningful work, but the understanding of it shifts, even at the artist's level.
Mm-hmm. There I have a direct question to Gerfried, because Ars Electronica since 37 years has, this knowledge and has fostered and supported media artists and engineers and, practitioners. Where do you see it, because you mentioned it, you see it a bit more critically. Do you feel that these kind of artists who are also at the forefront on developing their own technology, where do you see their position in this media art market-related business?
Well, probably outside of it. I mean, this is what I wanted to say also in the beginning. In all this, what we heard this morning, we are talking about this kind of art, whether it's media art, pencil art, or whatsoever. That is, of course, primarily visual art. That is, first we did it on the canvas, now we do it on the screen. And we have all these areas of media art that are going in completely other directions. I mean, of course, we have some notion now and tradition to include the performative aspect also into galleries and museums. But I think also what was said this morning, I mean, it's so easy to say, okay, well, let's not make a difference between media art or whatsoever. It's just about good art, and nobody would say pencil art. But I think media art is, in its definition and its origins, more than just artistic activity using the tool of digital technology or digital media. Media art also, in the way how it grew to become a substantial contribution to our time, is very much based on a critical reflection on how our time has been developing. This transformation into a digital culture is reflected by digital art, and what you also said, I mean, it is for a good reason that many of the famous older media artists are, of course, the ones who had to have a deep understanding of the technology, whether it's hardware or software or code. So I think there is all this this huge range of media art activities that is not intended to create something to be collected, but that is intended to be a contribution to this social transformation and change. And just because we have now all our screens in our pockets doesn't mean by no means that we understand the dynamics behind it. Even more, I think now we need this digging deeper and pointing out what's the meaning behind the systems. And I think that maybe for good reason, this is the artistic activity that is taking place outside the market-related, outside the collector-related art scene. And this is where, again, as I said this morning, festivals are a market on their own. They allow artists to create scenarios inside public space, or they allow the artists to have completely different ways of expressing, presenting, different ways of encountering and contact with the audiences. So I mean, of course, I think it was super nicely put together, you know, somebody representing a festival institution, an art producing institution, a museum, a gallery. I think it's a very good range that shows how many different interests and possibilities are there for the arts. And I think as long as we consider media art as one of the necessary forces in this process of developing into a digital society, we should rather focus on these areas where this art is really having an impact on society, and not so much where this art can finally end up in a safe haven to be collected for the future and for our heritage. I don't mean this is not important, and this is super important work that is being done, but from my point of view, I think it's extremely necessary to make sure that we have enough support enough spaces and possibilities for this art to happen. And I think this is at the moment an issue in this, and that's an issue for the symposium. We see also here in Linz, even in Austria, after a while, we see a big reduction of public spending. So there is, every time I hear this, you know, you're doing all this technical stuff, so why don't you get your money elsewhere from the industry? There is so much money in the art market, why don't you get money from there? So I think if we focus too much on this area, then we really might lose this, you know, really strong force of digital art.
But maybe, no, you start.
Yeah, I wanted to just briefly throw another lens on that. So I can very easily say, oh, just forget about this whole collection and market thing. Who cares when it comes to money or recognition? What is really important, as Gerfried says, is the cultural impact. But the two are also deeply intertwined, and this is really my motivation and driving force. My question is, who creates the cultural memory of it? Yeah? I mean, we always see that we're suffering from amnesia, you know? I mean, look at the market and what kind of tech products are thrown out, where you think, Jesus, they tried that 40 years ago, it was a miserable failure, we know why, and now you're trying this again the same way, you know? So we somehow need the cultural memory of the technologies, of the impact, and who's doing that? And I think that is what really museums on the one hand provide. They are creating this archive and preserve a kind of cultural knowledge. And I think they may not be the best institutions to do that anymore. We actually need other types of... Yes, but that is something we need to think about right now, I think. Perhaps the burden shouldn't be on museums anymore, or those types of institutions to maintain that cultural heritage, but also on other organizations, because I think what would be terrible would be if all of this is eradicated from the canon, from the history. And I don't mean that in terms of canonizing in the worst sense of the word, like putting it into a box, but I mean really in terms of a cultural memory and heritage, which we need to create of all of this, of the impact, and of what the art, what the technologies can do.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of related points, because I wouldn't disagree at all, that firstly, it's not just about the creation of the cultural memory, which I do think is important, but we shouldn't forget as well that part of the role of art is effectively activism. You know, it's effectively about being part of the process of affecting cultural change, and that if you take aesthetics in its original term, in the sense of not just the form, not just the look and feel of something, but the socio-political conditions which bring it about, which is actually what James Bridle's talking about in the New Aesthetic, and he gets very cross when people miss the point of what he's trying to do, which is about making manifest the controlling forces in our lives. That's really important. And that process is not going to be funded either in the private sector or the public sector a lot of the time, because it's threatening. So we have to have a mixed economy. But some of that mixed economy is people doing it for themselves outside of either of those systems, and certainly outside of any notion of, you know, preserving culture. So I think art is, you know, has many different roles and many different ways in which it gets made. And whilst I'm in the one sector, I think the other sectors are vitally important, and we should certainly not lose sight as art as an agent of socio-political change, and, you know, standing against and offering alternatives to, you know, the hegemonic neoliberal capitalist forces that structure people's lives today. So that's my thought.
I think it's time to open up for questions. Maybe we give one micro. Is there another microphone left here? Otherwise, we use here on stage.
Because you just mentioned that why exactly should be the preserving of the cultural heritage been taken away from the museums? Why it should be taken away? Why you don't want to do this any longer?
Oh, I'm not saying taking it away from museums. I think museums should continue doing that, but I also don't think that they're best equipped to pay attention to all of the segments of it, because right now we're already missing out on a lot because decades of important work have not been collected, and I'm not sure if they will make it into collections. Just talking about what Steve just mentioned, the activist type of work, for example, is a museum really the best place to create the cultural record of that? So my ideal would be that different types of organizations actually feed into each other, but I'm not sure if a museum can really do all of that. If I think about Ars Electronica and what is amassed in the archives and what kind of cultural knowledge is there, that is something that a museum wouldn't have, nor will any museum, I think, catch up on that. So we just need to make sure that those histories are aligned to some extent or feed into each other. I do not want museums to give up on being that kind of cultural memory and archive, but again, the Whitney Museum could never catch up with what Rhizome has done as a relatively small organization with the art base, with the tools they have developed, which we're highly benefiting from today.
Just one anecdote that just sprung into my head. There's some artists we work with, and they were commissioned by a major American museum to do an online piece of work. And they were asked to remove the word Muslim, any reference to Muslim and Islam in the work. And that's the constraints that often, museums are working under. And so there has to be alternatives. And for another example is there was an exhibition of some beautiful photographs in Cardiff in the UK. And there were images of sites that had been raised by the Israelis to make way for pieces of Palestinian villages that had been raised by the Israelis to make way for the Jewish state, the Zionist state, to be very precise. And there were the big, large format photographs, and next to them was the wall text that explained what you were looking, that said, gave the background. Within 3 or 4 days, the wall text was no longer there because the museum had been told it was anti-Semitic. And I was in a seminar where this came up, and people saying that's not the half of it. Some of us wouldn't be able even to put the initial exhibition up. So there's these huge institutional pressures because of where the museum's money comes from and the pressures they're under. So I mean, I think we do need that, and to enable that sort of work to be put on. That's really questioning what's happening in the world today. And without that mixed economy, and without places that can exist outside of some of those forces, you're not going to have an open society.
I think there are some more questions. Mm-hmm. Please raise your hand, all the people who want to ask questions. 1, 2.
I just wanted to say something concerning the digital archive and museums. I'm part of the digital artist group Station Rose, established in 1988 in Vienna. The same year we were invited to Museum Ludwig in Cologne to make a performance and installation there. And I was working with Commodore Amiga and Gary with Atari, but for sure the museum didn't have any devices, so they proposed that we change it to Kodak carousel slides. And so we did that. So we had 200 computer graphics in Kodak slides, and we made the performance with these projections. So the case within these slides was somewhere in the studio for decades. And last week there was an opening in a brand new exhibition space in Vienna, where we showed 4 of these pieces. And it's really interesting to see what transfer processes happen par hasard sometimes, because slides was only the second best solution. But now you could say it's so easy to access, it has a very good quality. If you put it in Hasselblad scanner, it's perfect. You can boost it up as big as you want. And it's more difficult for me to get access to early Amiga graphics, SideQuest hard drives, etc., from, let's say, beginning 90s, than to these slides. And it's really interesting. You have 30 years, and you have a brand new situation where you see it on Büttenpapier. So I think there are interesting processes happening in the next time just to get access to early computer art.
I think what you are referring to is that many artists, I think, have a very urgent need to really bring their works out and, you know, also bring it into the collections and into the museums. So many media artists, that's how I interpret it also, what you said, are really willing to collaborate as long as possible also in transforming their works or sort of putting it into those archives.
I mean, I wouldn't have thought of using it, but when we reached 20 digital years in 2008, we put up a first archive, digital archive, and there were just 2 images on it. So somebody approached us from this exhibition space and said, "Do you have more?" And this is this is the fact.
Thank you, Elisa. There was a lady over there. You're from the CREMS study program. Maybe you could quickly introduce yourself and also the people tell a little bit about your study program in CREMS, because maybe not everybody knows it.
Erasmus Mundus program. We study now in CREMS. It's a high mobility program and means that we're gonna travel.
Sorry, we don't hear you well up here.
So I'll just restart. We are from Erasmus Mundus program. It's media, arts, sculptures. We just started. We are second wave of students, and we're gonna travel. So we're gonna study in Austria, in Denmark, in Poland, and some of us will go to Hong Kong. And well, we just started, and I personally enjoyed the conversation. And I have a question. I lived in Belgium for a while. And I know that some institutions in Belgium, they proudly say that they are production houses, not only that they help to disseminate the arts, but they proudly say that they are production houses. Which for me, it's kind of, I don't know if you find it dangerous or not, but I think it's kind of an institution, as you said just a while ago, institution has a final right to say what an artwork should look like and what kind of references it can make. So I was just wondering what could be the alternatives to that. If a university or museum has a resident, for example, and then they say, we want that kind of artwork and not the other one, maybe though you would be interested to do that, what could be the alternatives to that? Because it's narrowing down some things. I mean, maybe it's not allowing really to experiment that much. And for some artists, I think there are a lot of interesting people who could do a lot of interesting work, but not everyone can get into the institution at certain point as well. So I don't know what would be your thoughts. Thanks.
You're addressing this question to a specific speaker here or to the whole panel?
To all of you.
Well, first of all, I really think that this is being misrepresented a little bit. So, I mean, following this conversation, I suddenly hear, oh, museums have the final say over what an artwork produced is like, and that is effectively not true. You know? So all of the conversations I've been involved in are extremely thoughtful, and there are, as a public institution, you know, there are areas where you can get very offensive to people and where it's predictable what kind of heat you will get from certain kind of communities. And sometimes that's not productive. But what we would say in these cases is, to the artist, perhaps we're not the right institution to do this. But I don't want to create the impression that there is this censorship, oh you can't say this, you can't say that. I mean, that particularly in the US, that creates a media storm. The first thing the artist would do is go to all of the press, and there we have it. It becomes a public discussion. So I think that's not the case, but that being said, I think it's really important to have diverse outlets for production. You know, I mean, what a mainstream museum will produce is very different from what smaller types of organizations, activist organizations will do, and what also can be tolerated. Like when I do an exhibition at the New School's gallery, I have a lot more leeway of putting on certain types of works where I won't run into problems, while at the Whitney Museum, you know, they would get a lot of lawsuits, legal pushback, so you're operating in a completely different space. And I think as an artist, you also have to think about, where do I go, you know, which also means more production money for different types of outlets, and, you know, grant money that needs to be made available to diversify. So I think diversification is really key.
It's terribly limited if you're practicing new media art to not allow yourself the freedom to do everything you need to do. And once again, it's the role of the museums to try to interpret that and actually figure out how to archive it. But it's really important today because it's so wide open, the medium of new media, that you should let it go and try to create, you know, as exponentially as you can. And then, of course, it's the role of these institutions to interpret that and preserve it, but you shouldn't limit yourself. That's all I had to say. No question.
Are there more questions now? Yes, here's another question, please. We have 5 more minutes.
Good. Okay, so we've talked about how some forms of media art or even like performance are hard to preserve and to archive. And when it comes to the art market, as galleries and people that commercialize with that, I think it's important to preserve it. Like the example one of you gave of the black screen 5 years later, that the artwork is no longer there and people get mad. So in these cases, I guess there are some artists that just don't care about preserving their artwork, and maybe the intention is not to be preserved. And you mentioned there are some interfaces to emulate other softwares and to preserve the artwork. So my question is, what is your personal approach or opinion when an artist doesn't care about preserving their work?
Well, actually, that's totally fine. I mean, if you really create your work to be in the moment and to be lost forever, that's fine. That's a decision some artists make. I have seen over time also attitudes change. The older artists get, the more they actually think about preserving their body of work and the impact they have had on the world. Well, you know, in their 20s, many people would say, just let it go. And I think that's fine, you know. But again, if you look at things over time, I get sometimes sick and tired as a teacher, to be very honest, to see people reinventing the wheel and doing the same project again and again and again, you know, over, 10 years gaps, because there is no knowledge of the history, and worst case scenario, because I have to stand in front of them describing the work to them, because there's no record of it anymore. And I think that is really the problem, to say, yes, artists have done that like 20, 30 years ago, in a really terrific way, only there's nothing I have to show for it. But in general, I think it's, you know, there's a whole history of artworks that were meant to be in the moment and have been destroyed forever. But I don't like that state of complete cultural amnesia where we constantly keep reinventing the wheel.
I think the artist is obviously it's perfectly within the artist's right to say that. I would just say that there are other people, whether it be, you know, a curator like Christian or a gallerist like me, but more importantly, actually probably a curator like Christian, who could say, well, actually, I think that's quite important, and who can do something towards the preservation of it. So, you know, sometimes it's not a question of ignoring the artist's wishes. It's more a question of saying there is something that's culturally important here that this person is doing, and even if they're not going to work with us to preserve it, we can still do something about preserving some sort of trace which passes into the cultural record and which can then be used in you know, either, you know, to inspire future generations, as it were. So yeah, obviously the artist can say, I don't care, but that doesn't mean to say you then have to sort of not care as well.
So I already got the mic. If the conservation is the key, should we talk about a certain standard that's accepted by everybody that makes it easier to conserve it and collect it and, yeah, learn about the media art? Because as I know it, every artist just documents its work how he thinks it's the right way. But if the conservation is the problem in the scene, should we talk about a certain standard that everybody documents its work in the same way, so it makes it easier to collect it, to conserve it, to talk about it, to learn from it, and all that?
Look at the Media Matters project, which is Tate, SF, MoMA, and MoMA, with the New Art Trust, is it, the Kremlix, which are working to, you know, come up with sets of standards. And if you go to the Media Matters website, there's all sorts of advice about standards, that common standards that can be used. And then for us, as gallerists, you know, we are working, you know, with collectors and with other galleries in the same as Raphael contract, to come up with, you know, standardized contracts that addresses a lot of the issues. But I do think at the moment, as Christiane pointed out at the end of her lecture, there's a number of different models, you know, to do. And so I think we're still at a very early stage.
The simple answer is there are no standards. So what we're talking about here are best practices. And like Media Matters, the Variable Media Network, etc., they have created a lot of really useful information for best practices. But there is no standard for a work. Like, it's also not saying like storage or emulation or any of this is better than another thing. All decisions have to be made on a case-by-case basis. So basically, every artist has to do the work themselves. There are obvious things. If you're working with software that will constantly change, of course, you should have a GitHub repository in which you very carefully document the changes. Of course, there are best practices for annotating your code and making it easier. So those are definitely steps to follow. But other than that, I mean, there is no standardization of an artwork per se.
I'm not talking about a standardized artwork. I'm just talking about a standardization of the documentation of artworks in its different kinds.
No, because every work needs a different kind of documentation, almost. So again, you can look at the best practices. What Raphael Lozano-Hemmer is talking about is helpful. Again, all the Variable Media Network, Media Matters, DOCAM, all of what they have created as best practices are really, really helpful. But other than that, all of this has to be applied to your own work.
Thanks.
And actually, I think I'd even avoid using the word best practice and just say good practice.
But it's just interesting. I mean, this would be a much longer discussion now, how the appreciation for at least some sort of standard is growing from the festival to the museums to the galleries. And I think, of course, that's an issue of market. I mean, going into the market, if you think of an artist that you would want to end up collected in galleries or by private collectors, there is no way around standardizing. You have to change your work of art into the modalities that fit into this market. And this is not a kind of, conspiracy critique or whatsoever. This is just the pure reality of it. And this is, again, why I think besides of course, looking for, making sure your work of art and your impact remains for the rest of humanity as a cultural memory, or whether you just do it because you think, well, finally I deserve some share of the money that is spent in this market. No matter what the motivation is, you have to understand that you have to play according to some rules. And well, that's again, maybe let's try if we can also find and develop alternative markets, not because I want the alternative in terms of being against the existing art market, but because I think there is so much in the range of media art that has much more individual specific characteristics that at the end, I think we will end up in a situation that in the same way as we have an art market for visual arts, we have an art market for theater, we have an art market for music, we have an art market for dance. So, well, I think media art will end up with some own original art market that is able to really respond to the characteristics. Maybe not in 5 years, but let's see.
Thank you, Gerfried. That was a very nice ending statement. So I would like to end this morning session.